Hello, everybody. My name is Ian, and today we're talking about Diane Ty's Feeding Our Family Well, which is Chapter 2 of Baking as Biography. Today, I'm going to be making oat cakes, that classic Atlantic Canadian fare. I have a cup of brown sugar and a cup of shortening. And once again, I'm going to attempt creaming them. This recipe, as you have read, of course, comes from not her mother's collection directly, not directly, but actually comes from her grandmother's collection. So this is really a matrilineal inheritance. Her grandmother, Belle, was always on the lookout for a better oat cake, in part because oat cakes were expected. Oat cakes fill this remarkable part of Atlantic Canadian foodways because, well, to begin with, we want to remember that there were circumstances that occasioned particular cuisines. Now, I use the word cuisine loosely, because often cuisine is something that we will associate with a food system that has some kind of status or idea of taste in the sort of Bourdieuian sense. French cuisine, even Tex-Mex cuisine. We don't necessarily apply the word cuisine to more humble food systems like Atlantic Canada, and then I need to ask ourselves why we don't. But we have a system that is both that how does one provide for a family in terms of giving that the necessary energy, the necessary ingredients that are required in order to feed anyone, while simultaneously doing so in a way that is within one's means. Not simply within one's direct means, but within one's understanding of one's means. And that's a point that's going to come up later. And using available resources. While also, as best as one can, when one can employ something along the lines of that luxury, also fulfilling the expectations of cultures of taste. Taste that one has passed down through the codes of cooking for family members from generation to generation. Once again, I'm not the best at creaming things, shortening, and sugar. This sugar might be a little bit on the lumpy side to begin with, but that's okay. So oat cakes were actually a fairly decent way of providing a family with filler. That they were a part of the dinner or part of a tea, and they worked within the context of food as fuel. Food that was there to basically fill someone up, to give one basic energy. And they were not within that larger context of treat, depending on the ability to exercise luxury. Luxury isn't quite the word, but you know what I'm looking for. The ability to exercise a certain amount of liberty that most of us beyond the above the absolute levels of despair and want, most of us are able to exercise some kind of choice. But sometimes refuse to, there we go. But will sometimes choose not to, save for particular special occasions. So oat cakes are just a way of filling up. They literally fill up the plate, they fill up the stomach, they are not necessarily there for any kind of purpose. And they are a large part of the Scots heritage of Atlantic Canada. They are, oats are easy enough to produce, they are shelf stable, and they are a constant. And one of the things that we read in this chapter is that Lorraine herself and Henry didn't particularly like oat cakes, but recognized them as part of the set of expectations of the plate. What was anticipated being there, especially once they got to Cape North, his first parish in Cape Breton, where oatcakes were doubly important. And so it was a form of hospitality. He, as minister, going from house to house, the visits that one does, was confronted with oatcakes and would eat them, and did not necessarily like them very much. But that's what you do as a form of one of the reciprocating aspects of hospitality, is that guests accept food, and they accept the food that is provided as the food that one provides for guests within a particular cultural context. So Henry would eat oatcakes, and conversely, it was expected, it was culturally normative for Laureen, when she entertained other people in the community, to have oatcakes as part of the offerings. And again, it is a frugal way of passing, of allowing this to happen, because it is so much it's so economical to make the original form of oatcake. The original form of oatcake, basically, as Diane points out, is somewhere between bread and cookie, or bread and cake, in that earlier in its forms, it's much more filler. It is much more on the bread spectrum. I am going to be adding, that's a word, an egg, which I could have been apparently adding all along, or adding all along. No. Look at me. Don't want to dirty a second fork. There we go. Right, this gets much better, much faster, if I recall from the last time I had to cream, sugar, and egg, and shortening. Laureen didn't like oatcakes herself. Henry didn't like oatcakes. Now, they were part of a taste of childhood. For Laureen, she had oatmeal absolutely every day for breakfast. And so oats, there was nothing particularly glamorous about them. Nevertheless, they constitute a taste of childhood. And they constitute a way of feeding the family well, which is, again, the title of the book. And so when she is making oatcakes, she is recognizing that, first of all, there is the expectations of what it is to be an Atlantic Canadian woman, and one of the things it is to be an Atlantic Canadian woman in the 1950s, especially one with a certain amount of public status, by being the minister's wife, is to provide this food for guests, for company, for family, but on the sort of public persona. But the other idea is bringing forward those foods that are considered important from childhood. Because one of the things that, how we define good food, one of the points that Diane makes, is that we define good food in large part based on the food that we have brought over with us from our childhood. That foods, that in retrospect, when we think of foods, and you can make the argument for comfort food as filling this particular category, but when we think about foods, we think about the foods that perhaps our parents provided for us. I'm having a whole bunch of insights as I'm reading this chapter, and I'll say that might explain. I think there's this issue of nurturing work that is bubbling beneath the surface of this. Very clearly, it is part of this. The nurturing work that can happen. And if you have a sense that you are nurtured, then the food that you remember from childhood will in part be intertwined with that sense of nurturing. That this food, even if you don't necessarily like it, like the oat cake or the taste of oats, that this food symbolizes the caring work that is done for you. The whole book, the whole book in general, and this whole chapter has a lot of grappling with the idea that these tastes, these foods that were provided, were clearly Laureen doing caring work for her family and her husband by anticipating the tastes that they would like, by bringing in tastes that she thinks is appropriate. And those two can be in some kind of dynamic tension, to catering her repertoire, to continually be seeking out improvements to that repertoire, for the foods to, at the very least, serve the same functional purpose, if not necessarily be the exact same food. As I progress as a folklorist, and I get better and better at understanding, I don't know if I will ever fully understand. So I have an egg, and I have 2.5 cups of oats, and now I'm throwing that in. Oh, might as well throw in the flour now. And then I have a teaspoon of, this is soda, and a teaspoon of salt. And again, they say vanilla. I'll slug that in. And the recipe also says that if you're making it with rolled oats, as I am, you can throw in a half a teaspoon of nutmeg, and I have also thrown in a half a teaspoon of allspice. Why? Because I like allspice. And I think that's a good enough reason for adding it to my thing, because I'm not beholden to it. Obviously, I'm doing this in part as an experiment, and seeing what these things might have tasted like. But I do not think I am necessarily, this isn't, for me, this isn't an exercise in food archaeology. I am trying to work within the set of expectations and still meet my patterns. So when I see nutmeg, I think, you know what also goes well with nutmeg? Allspice. You know what also goes well? Cinnamon. But I'm not throwing that in. Not that I don't like cinnamon. I just think perhaps that's one bridge too far. So this is all right, I was going back to, as I consider myself developing as a folklorist. I am more and more convinced that the study of folklore is really the study of audiences. It's the study of audiences as understood by cultural performers. What makes a good baker, what makes a good storyteller, what makes a good fill in the blank is someone who operates and can work in that wonderfully fuzzy, diffuse line between meeting expectations and nevertheless demonstrating some kind of individuality within them. So meeting the expectations while nevertheless still being surprising, wanting to go back to listen to this person, hear this person, eat this person's food again and again. The chapter opens up with a wonderful ethnographic moment. And again, her book, Diane's book, is filled with autoethnographic accounts. Should I start mixing this with like my hands? Should I be old-timey and old-fashioned that way? I think I will. I think it's just going to be a little bit easier for me to mush everything in. Don't worry, I cleaned absolutely every square inch of my hands before I started this. And by the way, no one else is going to eat this apart from me, so I could sneeze all over this. Oh, why am I including this part in the video? I will not, I have not, but I could. So the chapter begins with this wonderful ethnographic moment where she is back from she's back in high school. She's coming home. So the weekend, it's late, everyone's asleep. And she does what she always does when she comes home. She goes into the pantry and she sees all the tins that are there. And she opens the tins and sees, oh, what's on store this week? And it's that strange blend of she knows the foods, but she doesn't necessarily know exactly what foods are going to be in that pantry at that particular moment. And there could be a new offering, like, oh, what's this? There are going to be standards. There are going to be things that are always there, like biscuits. And there are going to be things that are perhaps there seasonally. And there's going to be things that are perhaps novelties, new efforts, or variations on an old effort. And so she can pick and choose, take what she wants, have her bed lunch, the great Atlantic Canadian name for a meal that takes place just immediately before bed. Midnight snack is what other people might refer to it as, but it's meant to sort of be somewhat sustaining. And you can make an argument, goes back to farming or goes back to the fisheries, and sure, go nuts with that explanation, because it's probably correct. But what was I talking about? How do I incorporate? Very stingy, and the idea of like something not quite being incorporated worries me. So this is nice and heavy and thick. Okay. Sticky. So that moment of her in her mother's kitchen, the mother's pantry, coming home, reminds me of sort of descriptions that one might have of a singer-songwriter or a storyteller, and that their repertoire is wide and expansive. And everyone kind of knows, but still appreciates the artistry that goes into them. Not necessarily a whole bunch of new stories from iteration to iteration, but whatever one particular performance might comprise, that might be what is surprising. And it's this, again, knowing what people like, knowing what is on offer, knowing what is seasonally or what is familially appropriate, adjusting one's repertoire over time in order to make sense, in order to continue to meet those expectations. That's kind of what is here. Alrighty. Oh no! One too far. Just gonna mush that in, because that's how I roll. Oh, look, I made a baking pun. I wasn't really even trying to. Oh, yeah. This is just a cheapy one. It's the only rolling pin they have at Walmart, which says something about our times, doesn't it? So there we go. Now, the instructions say cut how you want, and I am not going to engage in the great Atlantic Canadian feud between those who think oat cakes have to be round and those who think oat cakes have to be square. I'm making it square because I have nothing invested in the outcome, and it's just that much easier for me to do so. And I'm pretty sure that Atlantic Canadians don't use pizza cutters when they do this. Now, I also discovered that I'm out of parchment paper, so I'm using pan. What you gonna do? So let's see. It's funny when you read the descriptions of Henry's first encounters with Laureen's oat cakes, because she didn't get this skill. Her mother. Oh, hold on. I'm going to do the rest on the other tray. So her mother, Laureen's mother, got this much later in life, this particular recipe. So it's unclear whether it was even in Laureen's repertoire before leaving for Cape North. All right. 375 degrees. Middle rack. Middle rack. 8 minutes. Because the oat cakes changed over time. We were just saying it's a matter of audiences, but audiences aren't constants. Audiences are as influenced by um, general trends, by the recognition that certain habits, certain forms that were perhaps incumbent on an older generation do not necessarily apply anymore. Certain different forms of influences, certain displays that they wish to make in terms of their food consumptions, different integrations, different audiences, different groups that they are part of. And so over time, food can shift. And so even Laureen's own mother, now four generations back, was looking to adapt to the contemporary while simultaneously maintaining the consistent. Because she knew her audience was changing and her own tastes were changing. So the book describes, this particular chapter describes a number of different core foods that were very much tastes of home, but they were identity foods. That one of the things that was present in one of the conspicuous flavors that's present in Atlantic Canada, molasses. And again, you look around and there is no molasses fields, there's no sugarcane. It is part of the long history of trade between Atlantic Canada and the Caribbean, where wood and fish, in particular, lumber and fish would go down to the Caribbean, and we in turn would get sugar and rum from there. We would also have, there's also part of a triangle, because it would often be our worst fish and our cheap lumber and our cheap boats that would go down to the Caribbean. And we would in turn get the raw sugar and the grog rum, like Screech in the Newfoundland habit. Meanwhile, the good fish and the good lumber would go to England or Europe, particularly England, and the good sugar and the good rum would go to England from the Caribbean. So we would be in this as colonies, again, thanks to racism, not necessarily equal colonies, but both different from the colonizing home. We would be parts of this interesting trade triangle. So molasses is part of the Atlantic Canadian diet into the 19th century. By the time the 19th century occurred, and industrialization and other facets, and she's written extensively on molasses, so I'll just defer to her work, or refer you to her work. Refined sugar, white sugar, was becoming what was being pushed by industry as not simply the better sugar, but the more elegant sugar, where refined, in almost both senses of the word, that refined tastes would have white sugar, would have refined sugar. And recipe starts to show that as early as the late 19th century and continues in to the over the 20th century. So the cookbooks, recipe books, as we'll see in the next chapter / video, recipe books that are meant to sort of display this new kind of post-war elegance and how we might wish to present ourselves outside of our homes, would often reflect the white sugar, refined sugar, icing sugar, powdered sugar, and so on. Those recipes that were still very much passed along through, I don't want to say through folk processes, because these elegant ones were also passed along through the similar processes, but the ones that were kind of in that more matrilinear sense, and really the ones that were designed for a certain kind of performance in the home, often retained molasses as a dominant theme, in part because they were demonstrating rural, rustic, authentic folk roots. And I'll put authentic in big quotes and folk in big quotes. Not that they were disingenuous, but that there was something about the very humbleness of molasses-based food to begin with that was demonstrating something. I'll just leave it at something. Just going to bring my cooling rack over here. Well, my pot rack over here. And then my cooling rack as well. Here's a raw piece of dough, and I'm going to eat it. That's good. Oh, that's good. I don't need to bake these. I do. The oat is very oaty. But still, not too bad. So anyway, what were we talking about? We were talking about these tastes of home. This understanding of audience. So just as Lorraine's mother, Belle, was constantly looking for new and adaptive recipes in order to meet the expectations of the oat cake, the cultural expectations, the filler role, while simultaneously also adapting it for lighter and sweeter tastes. This is a early 1950s version, which has soda in it. It has more flavors in it. It's already starting to bridge that level between bread. An oat cake is basically fundamentally a form of bread, to something along the lines of a treat. Henry explains that oat cakes for him were kind of like potatoes. That's a really great analogy. And then it says, you don't go to Tim Hortons for a potato. So the oat cake is not something that fits into that category of specialness. Nevertheless, it needed to be there. Because key to this is Lorraine understanding that she was always going to be adapting her recipes according to expectations, and constantly refining based on how her children, how her husband's tastes were adapting over time. The youngest boy, the boy, Mark, but who's the youngest child, he was the pickiest eater. So as a way of adaptation, his tastes were often the most catered to. Either the more demonstrably chill children, or the actually more chill children when it came to taste. Gotta get that. Let's see what we have. Those are the odd-shaped ones. These are the square ones. And yep. They do rise a little. They do expand a little. But not as much as them white cookies. So the whole family's repertoire bends in some ways to the pickiest eater. And that's more or less okay. But she had to have an understanding of tastes. She had to demonstrate. Well, she didn't have to demonstrate, because that implies that there was some kind of acclamation that she was expecting. It was as far as she was concerned, and really as far as the culture was concerned, it was presumed that she would be accommodating for her family's tastes, and that was the condition. There might be Henry's first and foremost, or it might be the pickiest eater. But she knew them. She had this understanding, and there's this great moment where Diane is sharing a recipe with her, and Lorraine rejects it out of hand, says, your father doesn't like sour cream. And Diane didn't realize that her father didn't like things, because she had never seen him refuse things. And the reason she'd never seen him refuse things is that Lorraine had never given him something that he would refuse. And that is not him being accommodating necessarily. Again, as I have to say, with no disrespect to Henry, it's her being observant, her employing trial and error, and her understanding that was what was expected of her. The key to this is that so much of it is fundamentally invisible. So the labor that was expected was invisible. That it would be potentially conspicuous if she did it poorly. But it's the invisibility of it. The fact that she was able to meet these expectations, and her family almost literally did not notice. And I say almost literally because it's only when she is gone that it is recognized how much of that work that she was doing. And a lot of it is, again, one of the reasons why we can be thinking about oat cakes as opposed to perhaps the more dynamic parts of the repertoire, is that it's based sort of on a point that she makes about Mark's memories, and that Mark has more consistent memories of the stuff that was always there, the stuff that was sort of central to the repertoire, that was unmarked, that wasn't necessarily ceremonial, and that he can remember perhaps contexts when these things happen, but they're not the taste that would necessarily go forward. And it's not because we save the fancier or the more ceremonial or perhaps the more ephemeral and the more fashionable foods for special occasions. That might be a condition, but really it's that sort of quotidian aspect. It's the part that is of the everyday that is ultimately the stuff that carries forward, and that's the kind of food that would be reproduced in the next generation. Another aspect, and I think she spends a lot of time talking about this, is that since this was something that was expected of all the women in the community, and again, you could make an argument for all women everywhere, at least at this time, there was an implicit status that was there, at least an implicit expectation among her peers. And there's that great anecdote that Lorene is actually Diane is remembering Lorene's account of it, where she was embarrassed by through someone basically making a joke that the milkman had one of the squares and had gotten violently ill, according to the milkman's assistant. And he said this in front of other people at the hockey rink. And she was sort of mortified at that. And then it turns out that the milkman had not only wasn't sick, but hadn't eaten the square at all, because the milkman's assistant ate them both in front of him, and has never had her food. But she needed to save face. And the point of the story is not the saving face, but the fact that it's part of the story is kind of one of the reasons to include it ethnographically, is that she needed to save face among the other women at the rink who overheard the story, to assure that no, I do provide healthy and good and safe foods for the family, because that would be something that we would see within the culture, within the occupation, again, because everyone was expected to have a certain amount of competency. It wasn't talked about in cultural scenes. Women weren't always talking about baking all the time in the way that we might see in other occupational scenes, in terms of developing the canon of work technique. But I am sure that if you were to see it otherwise, see someone else doing it poorly, that would be a subject of conversation. And again, not necessarily part of their verbal art, but in retrospect, through interview, they were often talking about who made the best of one particular food. Lorene made the best chocolate chip cookies, and even though she shared the recipe, other people couldn't make them the way that Lorene made them, and then she became this point of envy. This envy that envy's too hard a word, but in that general area. But she achieved certain amount of esteem from Mark's friends, and I love that friend of his who still remembered the chocolate chip cookies that he made that she made for him long into his university days. And this reminds me when I was in university, and I had a friend whose mother sent care packages to Toronto. This is when I was doing my master's, and I had been allowed to sample her hot sauce, And the next time she sent a care package, she sent a hot sauce, an additional hot sauce, particularly for me. Like that, that's just nice. You got to love that sort of thing. But yeah, so, I forever remember Mrs. Cronin, people remember Mrs. Ty and the cookies. And she had, among the neighborhood kids, she had this reputation for making the best chocolate chip cookies. And again, that demonstrates an understanding of baking, an understanding of the responsibilities of baking, an understanding of the audience for this baking, and none of this did she get particular pleasure from. Baking was not a way that she chose to express herself. Baking was not a hobby. Baking was not a way that she performed tradition or performed femininity or performed motherhood. It didn't have that sort of reflective quality. You get the impression that if she didn't have to do it, she wouldn't have done it. That's not to say that she didn't like cookies, but she might not have. There is this frugality that's in place, and that one of the ways that they are, one of the things that they do is going back to that first ethnographic moment when she comes home, when Diane comes home and opens the pantry and there's all those foods, that abundance is an important value, but also frugality. You need to have enough food that is there. That food needs to express variety. That is a cultural value. There needs to be abundance. That is a cultural value. But there can't be too much. There can't be waste. There can't be, and often, certainly for the foods for the home, without undermining the kinds of ways that we wish to dote on children and cater to their tastes, and dote on family members and cater to tastes of the people that we love. It still needs to be economical, because there is that sort of social responsibility. And what's that line from it? I can't think of an occasion so special that cookies would be purchased. And so Diane wonders where all the tins came from in the first place, because they were all reused cookie tins, and there's only so much sewing kits a person needs. I'm like, well, where did they come from? She doesn't remember buying cookies. But those reuse of tins. So there is something, and that's a cultural value that is not necessarily a reflected on display of frugality. That is only in retrospect is to see, they are meeting expectations with an intelligent understanding of how long things last, how to do it in an efficient way, how to perhaps condense all one's baking into one day. And so just a flurry of bread and scones and cookies and squares and, there's something this week, so I might need to make that. That is a remarkable amount of engineering and planning and forethought and an understanding of everything from how an oven works and how long it takes for it to heat up and cool down, to how to clean a pan efficiently so you can use it again that day, to all these things, which are displays of competency. And again, that's going to go unremarked on. It's going to go uncommented upon, because that's just what you do. And it's that just what you do. That is just what you do that comprises so much of this. How much of it is incumbent upon them? How much of it is conditioned by the overarching patriarchy? Which brings us back to Henry, who again, all accounts, a lovely person who didn't necessarily recognize this, only in retrospect recognized the amount of work and amount of energy that went into it, in part because women's work is almost by definition meant to be invisible. That's again one of the displays, and one of the displays that you see in terms of 1940s, 1950s advertising, and that sort of, that perfect housewife who makes it look effortless. And by making it look effortless, you can say, oh, well, there was no effort. And then you can just, well, there you go. What do you do all day? I don't think Henry was like that, but I imagine that Lorraine's displays of effortlessness did not attract the attention that perhaps in a perfect world it should have. But Diane talks about invisible work as part of women's labor in the set of domestic expectations. And I mean, part of the feminist exercise is to recognize all the work that has been rendered invisible. The issue is what happens when it is invisible, because women themselves hide it. They are conditioned to hide it. They are conditioned to do so. But that strange movement, it's back and forth. It's kind of interesting. And now I'm just free associating. But effortlessness as a virtue of performance is, in the Italian idea, sometimes called Sprezzatura. Castiglione's The Courtesan introduced that term. That idea, that this sort of studied nonchalance, that what makes certain people, what makes certain art forms art, is the idea that it looks effortless. Like, I don't even need to put any effort into it. Now, that is a practice, but that is sort of the, my God, this is a good point. That is part of what it means to be good at this, is to make it look like, I don't even care. I just toss this up. Cookie. That takes years of being able to do it. When it fails spectacularly. And of course, there is the issue of like making it look like it's an enormous thing, because one thing, it is an enormous thing, but making it look like an enormous thing in order to attract attention. But there's a certain elegance when we see that, especially in contemporary cooking shows, where despite the fact that they are showing you all the labor that goes into it, they are simultaneously doing it, as it were, without effort, to make it look like this is simple, that this is casual, to make it look like they are doing it with very, very few, very little strain. And this sprezzatura, this effortlessness, this off the top of one's, to make it look like it's almost off the top of one's head, is, it's not an ideal, but at least it's a directive, a direction for the performance of cooking, the performance of baking. Wow, okay, wasn't expecting to talk about sprezzatura, but I think that is actually kind of key. I'm going to finally try one of these cooked. Which one? These look a little undercooked, but I think I like them. All right, follow directions. They're good. Yeah, they're good, but they're soft. They haven't sort of I mean, they're not supposed to have a snap, but they're basically like a very soft oatmeal cookie, which is pretty damn good if you ask me. Again, I will refrain from chewing too much in front of you. Who knows how many misophonics are watching this. So, again, I free associated. But thinking of it in terms of the various audiences, meeting tastes, developing tastes, changing repertoire, expanding repertoire, having things enter and exit a repertoire based in part on her own tastes, but mostly on the tastes of others, the tastes of the communities that she's going to be in contact with, and then the possibility of cultivating some kind of reputation, not in a, I mean, when we talk about status in a community, it isn't this sort of exercise in vanity, and it isn't this exercise in establishing some kind of nasty hierarchy, but esteem, recognition, these are all, at the very least, they can begin as value neutral ideas, like, yay, you're good at this thing is good, we like this, hey, can you bring your chocolate chip cookies? And so it's just something that, when it happens, it's lovely that it happens. One certainly doesn't want a reputation for being bad at something, unless that's going to serve an additional purpose. So anyway, I'm blathering. We're going to be coming back. Next video will be on Chapter 3, which is Church Ladies and Church Teas. Sorry, can't remember the exact name. Church Ladies and, yeah, I was right. Church Ladies and Ladies Teas. I was pretty close. Where we move beyond, because we can think of, just going back to this idea of audience, we can think of this book as basically 3 large clumps, overlapping Venn diagram style, but 3 large focuses. That's what chapters 2, 3, and 4 are on. 2 is on Lorene as a domestic baker, as a matriarch, as someone who has all these sorts of responsibilities in terms of invisible work. Chapter 3 is her role as minister's wife. It's already been part of it, but now it's going to be much more a part of it because it's about baking for other ladies, not her family. Every now and then, ladies from the community, men from the community, children from the community might have her domestic cooking, and that's a wonderful thing, but that's not really the primary audience. This is what happens when the expectations of baking for peers, and the peers who are comprised of, or the peers who comprise people in your same situation, people who also have households, who are also baking. Yeah. And again, that issue of status and esteem and reputation and all that enters into that. And the 4th chapter is baking for oneself, or baking for baking for a different peer group, not the peers in terms of your role of all the church wives, but friends. It's not that the church wives aren't friends, but that wasn't the occasion for the gathering, for the ladies' teas. Anyway, I'm going to stop. I will see you next video. As ever, my name is Ian. I don't know why I begin with as ever, my name is Ian. This has been chapter 2 of Diane Ty's Baking's Biography. Chapter is called Feeding Our Family Well. As ever, my friends, be well and eat well, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.